In a cozy corner of a bustling city coffee shop, Mira sat quietly, a young woman staring out the window as she sipped her cappuccino. Anyone passing by might have thought she was just another casual patron, escaping the day's rush. But inside, Mira's thoughts were in turmoil, and it had everything to do with the fresh grief she carried. Just 2 years ago, Mira had been riding high on a wave of success and joy. Her startup had just secured funding, and her life seemed bound for amazing things. But one day, her father, her constant source of strength and mentor, passed away suddenly. Mira was devastated, and though she had managed to keep her company afloat, the grief lingered. Then, not even a year later, her fiancé, her closest companion through the storm of building a business, was tragically killed in an accident. Sitting in that cafe, Mira felt more lost than ever. It wasn't that she didn't want to move on. She just didn't know how. So she turned to something she'd never imagined needing, a book on mental resilience. As she thumbed through its pages, 3 lessons stood out, each one echoing the kinds of wisdom her father would have shared with her. Each spoke to the kind of strength she'd need to rebuild her life. Lesson 1. The world doesn't owe you anything. Mira's father had a favorite saying, "Life's fair about being unfair." As a child, Mira had rolled her eyes whenever he said this, but now it struck a chord. Just the other day, Mira had bumped into an old friend, James, a talented chef whose restaurant had recently closed down after a flood destroyed its kitchen. James was heartbroken. "I've worked so hard to build this place," he had confided. "I don't deserve this." Mira understood his pain. She felt that same bitterness, that the universe had somehow cheated her out of her father and fiancé. But as she read, she realized that expecting life to owe her anything would only anchor her in frustration. Mira thought of her father again. He'd come from nothing, from a village where even school was a luxury. She remembered how, despite hardship after hardship, he'd risen to success without once complaining about how life had failed him. The world hadn't owed him anything either, yet he'd built a life Mira was proud of. So, instead of wallowing, Mira resolved to think of her setbacks differently. Her father's resilience had left a legacy for her, and she, in turn, could be her own legacy. She looked at her hands, still capable, still eager to work. The world didn't owe her a thing, and that was okay. She had what she needed to start again. Lesson 2. Focus on what you can control. The next lesson felt almost like a breath of fresh air in her life of overwhelming anxiety. After her father's and fiancé's deaths, Mira had been living in fear. Every bump in the road felt like a warning of the next disaster. She couldn't shake the feeling that her company would collapse or that something terrible was waiting around the corner. One night, this fear consumed her. After a long, grueling day at work, she had lain awake, paralyzed by worry. She had visions of her company failing, of losing her home, of losing more people she loved. But that night, she stumbled on an idea that would become her lifeline. Mira decided to write down all her worries. Then she divided them into 2 columns, one for things she could control and one for things she couldn't. In the can't control column, she listed her fears about losing loved ones, economic downturns, and unexpected disasters. But in the can control column, she listed the things she had the power to influence: her health, her daily habits, her professional goals, and her personal growth. She decided to act on what she could control, even in small ways. She started going for early morning runs, finding solace in the rhythm of her feet on the pavement. She began journaling, something she'd never had time for before. She set one new, achievable business goal every day and gradually started taking steps to rebuild. Letting go of things she couldn't control felt like breathing again after holding her breath for far too long. One day, she shared her 2-column technique with James, who was still struggling to cope with his restaurant's closure. To her surprise, he started using it too, eventually deciding to launch a small catering business that quickly took off. He, too, began focusing on what he could influence, leaving behind the crushing weight of what he couldn't. Lesson 3. Don't make the same mistake over and over. As Mira read about the 3rd lesson, she thought about the many mistakes she'd made, especially when it came to her work-life balance. She had sacrificed so much time with family and friends to build her business, promising herself that it would all be worth it once she made it. But after losing her father and fiancé, Mira realized there was no magical finish line where everything would suddenly be perfect. Instead, she decided to learn from her past mistakes and start fresh. She vowed not to repeat the pattern of sacrificing relationships for success, instead setting boundaries and building a support system she could rely on. Her first step was to apologize to her mother, who had often felt sidelined during Mira's intense startup journey. They spent more time together, finding comfort in shared grief and creating new memories. She also reconnected with friends she'd lost touch with, and on Fridays, she began leaving work early to have dinner with her old friend James. They'd laugh, share ideas, and reflect on how far they had come from their lowest moments. It wasn't always easy, but Mira knew that this was her chance to build a life where work didn't overshadow everything else. She wanted to grow in every way, not just as an entrepreneur, but as a friend, a daughter, and a person who could appreciate life's simple joys. By choosing to learn from her mistakes, Mira was stronger, wiser, and more balanced than ever. Her resilience was no longer about pushing through, but about growing with grace, something her father would have been proud of. Moving forward, it wasn't an easy journey, but Mira was learning that real strength wasn't about dodging pain or failure. It was about learning from both. She learned to focus on what she could control and to let go of expectations that life would always be fair. Most of all, she learned not to make the same mistakes again, cherishing each moment and relationship that life brought her way. As Mira finished her coffee and stepped back into the bustling city streets, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, a quiet, unshakable peace. And though her father and fiancé were gone, she carried their memories as reminders of the strength that would carry her forward through any storm life brought her way.